The winter of 2026 didn't just arrive in Pittsburgh, it laid siege to the city, burying the steel town grit under a suffocating, iron-gray blanket of frost and relentless sleet. Inside our house on the quiet, wine-swept outskirts near the old Monongahela Bridge, the atmosphere was just as frozen. I lay awake in the hollow darkness of our bedroom, staring at the ceiling where the shadows of the bare oak trees outside danced like skeletal fingers against the plaster. The radiator was a persistent, clanking ghost in the corner, hissing and groaning as it struggled to push heat through pipes that felt as tired as my own bones. I had spent 35 years on the floor of the Edgar Thomson Steel Works, breathing in graphite and heat, and the silence of retirement was still something I hadn't quite learned to trust. My body was a roadmap of industrial labor, shoulders that throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache and hands that had grown thick and calloused from decades of gripping iron. Beside me, the mattress was cold and flat. Diane's absence wasn't a new phenomenon. For months, she had been retreating into the living room, claiming the flickering blue light of the television helped her insomnia. But I knew the truth was hidden in the glow of the smartphone she clutched like a lifeline. We had been married for 17 years, a span of time that should have built a fortress of transparency. Yet I felt like a stranger in a house I had paid for with the sweat of 1,000 double shifts. The digital clock on the nightstand flipped to do 17 a.m. with a soft, mechanical click, and almost instantly, the silence was shattered. My phone didn't just ring, it screamed, the vibration rattling the wooden surface like a frantic heartbeat. When I saw Diane flashing on the screen, a cold pit formed in my stomach, a familiar dread that I had spent years trying to rationalize as husbandly concern. I answered with a single word, Grant, my voice sounding like dry gravel. On the other end, the sound was chaotic. I heard the sharp, high-pitched squeak of rubber wheels on linoleum and a low, rhythmic hum that Diane wanted me to believe was the sound of a trauma ward. Her voice broke through the static, jagged and breathless, saturated with a desperation that felt practiced. She told me that Caleb, my 22-year-old stepson who had always moved through life like a ghost looking for a place to haunt, was in a hospital bed in Lake Tahoe, 3 states away. She claimed he had been jumped outside a casino, his ribs shattered, his internal organs failing, and that the medical staff was refusing to administer the heavy-duty nerve blockers he needed to survive the night unless a $22,000 insurance deposit was wired immediately. As I sat up, the freezing air of the room biting at my bare chest, I felt the familiar weight of the safer name persona I had occupied for nearly 2 decades. I was the fixer, the wallet, the steady hand that smoothed over the jagged edges of Caleb's frequent disasters. I pictured Caleb at 12, skinny and defiant, and how I had tried to graft my own sense of work ethic onto a boy who was only interested in shortcuts. I had taught him to drive in the empty parking lot of the VFW hall, watching him grind the gears of my truck while Diane clapped from the sidelines, always shielding him from the consequences of his own laziness. "He's trying, Grant," she would always say, her eyes welling with tears that acted as a universal solvent for my resolve. But as she pleaded through the phone now, her voice rising into a scream that sounded more like a demand than a prayer, a different memory surfaced: the 3 a.m. call from 2 summers ago. The medical deductible I had sent that turned out to be a week of bottle service at a nightclub in Vegas. I stood up, my feet hitting the floorboards that felt like ice, and walked to the window. The streetlights cast a sickly orange glow over my Ford F-150, its wheel wells crusted with road salt, a vehicle that represented honest work. I asked her where she was, and her answer was to fast, to rehearsed Barton Hospital, she said. But her voice didn't have the echo of a high-ceilinged lobby. It sounded tight, like she was huddled in the closet or the back of a car. She started talking about Zelle limits, about maxed-out credit cards, and how Caleb was crying out for his dad. That word dad hit me like a physical blow, a calculated emotional hook designed to pull the money out of my retirement fund. Before I could think clearly, but for the first time in 17 years, the hook didn't catch. I felt a sudden, terrifying clarity, a realization that I was being hunted by the people I shared my table with. The smell of the menthol rub on my shoulders mixed with the cold air, And I realized that if I hit send on that banking app, I wasn't saving a life. I was funding a lie. I told her, my voice turning into a cold steel blade, to call Caleb's real father. The silence on the other end was absolute. A vacuum of sound that proved I had finally hit the nerve. Diane's voice shifted then, the grieving mother mask slipping to reveal a flat, cold anger I had never truly faced. She called me heartless. She screamed that I was abandoning family. But as I told her good night, Diane powered the phone off. The silence that returned to the room wasn't empty. It was the sound of a man finally putting down a weight that was never his to carry. Even as the furnace clicked in the basement, deciding once and for all that the warmth in this house had officially gone out. The hours between the end of that phone call and the first gray light of dawn felt like an eternity spent in a sensory deprivation tank. I didn't go back to sleep. Sleep is for men who have a clear conscience or at least a stable foundation, and mine had just been revealed as a sinkhole. I sat in the darkness of the living room, the only light coming from the pale, sickly glow of the street lamp reflecting off the snow outside, and I watched the shadows of the ceiling fan rotate like a slow-motion clock. Every creak of the house, every groan of the floorboards as the temperature plummeted, sounded like a footstep. I felt like a man standing in the middle of a frozen lake, hearing the first hairline fracture snap beneath his boots. I thought about the 17 years I had poured into Diane and Caleb, the double shifts at the mill, where the heat was so intense it felt like it was melting the skin off my forehead. The overtime I volunteered for so Caleb could have the right clothes and the right car, and the quiet pride I felt when I thought I was building a legacy. It was all a mirage. The 2 a.m. call had pulled back the curtain, and all I saw was a hollowed-out life dot by 5:45 a.m. The sky over Pittsburgh began to turn a bruised, muddy purple, the color of a fresh hematoma. I was in the kitchen, staring at a mug of coffee that had gone cold and oily, when the sudden, staccato flash of blue and red light began to dance across the wallpaper. It wasn't the frantic, chaotic light of an ambulance. It was the steady, rhythmic strobe of a patrol car. I didn't feel a surge of adrenaline. I felt a heavy, sinking sense of inevitability. I stood up, my joints cracking like dry kindling, and opened the front door before they even had a chance to knock. The cold hit me like a physical punch to the solar plexus, a sub-zero wind that smelled of frozen river water and diesel exhaust. 2 officers stood on my porch, their breath curling in the air like smoke from a guttering candle. The younger one looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from side to side. But the older one, Officer Miller, had the weary, professional gaze of a man who had spent too many years delivering bad news to people who didn't deserve it. "Grant Miller?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. He held a clipboard covered in a plastic sheath to protect the documents from the sleet. When I nodded, he didn't lead with a handshake or a greeting. He started reading from a stack of felony paper, work that felt like a death warrant for my reputation. The words identity misuse, fraudulent misrepresentation, and aggravated financial exploitation drifted through the freezing air, landing on me like lead weights. He explained that a young man, Caleb Vance, had been detained by the authorities in a parking structure attached to a high-end casino, not a hospital. There had been a struggle, an altercation over a marker, a line of credit worth $50,000. My heart did a slow, sickening roll in my chest as the officer pointed to the signature on the guarantor line. It was my name, my social security number, my credit profile, built over 3.5 decades of unblemished financial history, had been offered up as a sacrificial lamb to fuel Caleb's gambling addiction. I leaned my shoulder against the doorframe, feeling the rough texture of the wood through my hoodie, and listened as the officer described the irregularities. It wasn't just one marker. It was a web of accounts, small credit lines opened in my name over the last 3 years, all funneling money into a black hole I never knew existed. I realized then that while I was working the graveyard shift, breathing in the dust of the plant, Diane had been sitting in the office, perhaps using my own laptop to forge my life away. The officer's voice became a distant hum, like the sound of the wind in the power lines. My mind flashed back to the small things I had ignored, the way Diane always raced to the mailbox, When the credit card statements arrived, the way she insisted on handling the filing so I could rest my tired eyes, and the flickering light of her phone under the covers at night, I wasn't just a husband. I was a host being consumed by a parasite. Officer Miller looked at me with a grim sort of pity. He told me that Caleb was currently being treated for non-life-threatening injuries sustained during his arrest, a split lip and a bruised ego, but that the financial crimes were what would stick. He advised me to contact my bank immediately and warned me that because the amount exceeded a certain threshold, federal investigators might be stepping in. "This looks like an inside job, Mr. Miller," he said, his voice softening just a fraction. "Usually, people don't get this much access without someone in the house opening the door." I thanked him, my voice sounding like it belonged to a ghost, and watched as they walked back to the cruiser, their boots crunching in the frozen slush. I stood on that porch until the patrol car disappeared around the corner, the cold finally seeping through my clothes and into my bones. I wasn't crying, I was hardening. The safer name was gone. In its place was a man who had just realized that the war had been going on for years, and he was the only one who didn't know he was losing. I went back inside, closed the door, and locked every bolt, knowing that the real enemy already had a key. The morning sun didn't rise so much as it bled into the sky, a sickly, translucent gray that offered no warmth to the valley below. I drove through the heart of Pittsburgh's industrial corridor, where the skeletal remains of old mills stood like rusted cathedrals against the smog. Every pothole I hit sent a jolt through my spine, a physical reminder of the wear and tear I had endured to earn the life that was currently being liquidated behind my back. I pulled into the parking lot of Rudy's Diner, a squat, soot-stained brick building that had served as the unofficial headquarters for steelworkers since the days when the sky was permanently orange from the blast furnaces. The air inside was thick, a humid fog of sizzling pork fat, cheap tobacco clinging to old jackets, and the sharp, acidic tang of coffee that had been sitting on the burner since 4 a.m. It was a place for men who spoke in grunts and understood the value of $1 because they knew exactly how many drops of sweat it took to earn one. I spotted Walt Higgins in the far corner booth, tucked away near a window that was so frosted with grease and condensation you couldn't see the street. Walt was a man who looked like he'd been forged in a crucible. His skin was the texture of tanned leather, and his fingers were permanently stained with the grease of 1,000 machines. He was 80 years old, a retired foreman who had forgotten more about structural integrity than most engineers ever learned. He didn't look up as I slid into the vinyl booth, the seat groaning under my weight. He just nudged a thick, chipped ceramic mug toward me. "You look like a man who just watched his house fall into a sinkhole, Grant," he said, his voice a low, rhythmic rumble that sounded like a conveyor belt. I didn't answer with words. I pulled the stack of credit reports and police paperwork from my internal jacket pocket and laid them on the table. The paper felt heavy like lead sheets. I watched Walt's eyes as he pulled his spectacles from a tin case and began to read. He didn't skim. He analyzed. He traced every line item with a callous thumb, his brow furrowing deeper with every page. Round us, the diner was a cacophony of life, the clatter of heavy plates, the shouting of orders, the laughter of men who still had something to lose, but our booth felt like an island of silence. I watched a drop of condensation roll down the window, leaving a clean trail through the grime, and I realized that my life had been exactly like that window, obscured by years of built-up lies, until a single, sharp event forced me to see through to the cold reality outside. "This isn't a lapse in judgment, Grant," Walt finally said, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "And this isn't just a kid with a gambling problem. This is an audit. Someone has been auditing your life for the last 36 months. He pointed to a series of small, soft inquiries from lenders I'd never heard of, outfits that specialized in subprime loans and casino markers. They were spaced out perfectly, 3 to 4 months apart, just frequent enough to check my limits, but not so often that they'd trigger a fraud alert on my phone. She was testing the fences," Walt whispered, leaning in so the men at the next booth couldn't hear. "Diane wasn't just paying Caleb's debts, she was building a shadow economy She was using your credit to collateralize his life. The weight of it hit me, then the sheer calculation of it all. I thought about the nights I'd come home from the mill, exhausted to the marrow, and Diane would meet me with a smile and a warm meal, telling me I worked too hard and that she'd take care of the bills so I could rest. I had thought it was love. Walt was showing me it was a strategic maneuver to keep me away from the ledger. Every emergency she'd invented, every medical bill for Caleb's phantom injuries, was a brick in a wall she was building around me. Walt told me about a guy we used to work with back in the 80s, a machinist who'd been cleaned out by his own brother. By the time he woke up, Walt said, the bank owned his car, the state owned his house, and he was sleeping on a cot in his sister's basement. Don't be that guy, Grant. Don't let your loyalty become your headstone. He walked me through the cold, hard mechanics of what I had to do next. He told me that I needed to stop thinking like a husband and start thinking like a liquidator. I had to freeze every joint asset, move my pension into a shielded trust, and, most importantly, I had to stop talking. Silence is your only armor now, he warned. The moment you confront her, she'll go to ground. She'll hide the rest of the trail. You need to gather every scrap of paper, every digital footprint, before she realizes the safer name has grown a set of teeth. As I left the diner, the wind off the Allegheny River cut through my hoodie. But I didn't feel the cold. I felt a grim, industrial resolve. I looked at the old steel mills on the horizon and realized they were gone because they didn't adapt to the rot. I wasn't going to let that be my story. I was going to protect what was mine, even if it meant tearing down the house I had spent 17 years building. The drive back from Rudy's diner felt like navigating a minefield in a fog. The streets of my neighborhood, once so familiar and comforting, now felt alien, as if the houses were leaning in to whisper about the man who didn't know his own life was being auctioned off. I pulled the truck into the driveway, the engine ticking as it cooled, and sat there for a long time staring at the front door. I realized that for 17 years, I hadn't just lived in that house, I had been its primary support beam, holding up the weight of two people who were busy sawing through me. I let myself in. The silence of the foyer greeting me like a cold draft. The house smelled of stale cinnamon and the faint, chemical scent of the floor wax Diane used to keep up appearances. It was the smell of a stage set after the actors had gone home. I walked straight to the small spare room we called the office, a cramped, windowless space tucked between the kitchen and the garage that felt more like a tomb today than a workplace. The centerpiece of the room was a heavy, industrial-grade filing cabinet I had salvaged from a plant liquidation sale back in the 90s. It was a battleship gray monster, dented and scarred, with drawers that screamed on their rollers like a dying animal. This was Diane's domain. She had always insisted on organizing our records, claiming my hands were too rough for the delicate business of filing. I stood before it, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and pulled the bottom drawer. It resisted at first, stuck on a pile of old tax returns, but I yanked it with a force that nearly tipped the whole unit over. I began to dig through the layers of our history, the deed to the house, the receipts for the new roof, the mountain of paperwork Caleb had generated throughout his troubled youth. But then, tucked far into the back, hidden behind a thick, dusty folder labeled appliance warranties, I felt something different. It was a heavy, manila envelope, crisp and uncreased, as if it had been handled with extreme care. When I opened it, the contents spilled out onto the desk like a confession. My breath hitched. Inside were photocopies of every piece of my identity, my social security card, my birth certificate, my military discharge papers, and my passport. But beneath those were the true instruments of my destruction. There were several pre-approved credit applications for high-interest predatory lenders, all addressed to me. But the contact phone numbers listed weren't mine, they were burner numbers I didn't recognize. And then I saw the practice sheets. My stomach turned into a knot of cold lead. Page after page of legal pad paper was covered in my own name, written hundreds of times in Diane's fluid, graceful script. She had practiced my signature until she could mimic the exact way. I looped the G in Grant and the hurried, jagged slant of the R. It wasn't just forgery, it was an obsession. She had sat in this very room, Perhaps while I was sleeping after a 12-hour shift, and practice being me so she could sell me off piece by piece. Among the forgeries was a letter from an Atlantic City casino's legal department, dated 3 weeks prior. It was a notice of intent to lien, addressed to Grant Miller. It detailed a $50,000 debt that had been guaranteed by my pension assets. I felt a surge of nausea so strong I had to lean my forehead against the cool metal of the cabinet. The 2 a.m. phone call wasn't a sudden emergency. It was a desperate, last-ditch effort to get one final payout before the casino's lawyers showed up at our front door. She had been playing a game of chicken with my life, and she had finally run out of road. I looked at the signatures again. They were perfect to a bank teller or a remote clerk. They would look indistinguishable from the hand that had signed my marriage license. I took out my phone, my fingers trembling with a cold, focused rage, and began to photograph every single page. I photographed the practice sheets, the burner phone numbers, and the hidden debt notices. I was building a digital fortress to replace the one she had burned down. As I worked, I realized that every time I had apologized for being grumpy or suspicious over the last few years, she had been mocking me behind my back with a pen in her hand. The betrayal was so deep, so systematic, that it felt like it had rewritten my entire past. Every anniversary, every Christmas morning, every I love you was just another layer of camouflage. I carefully tucked the papers back into the envelope and replaced it exactly where I had found it. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a confrontation, not yet. I was going to follow Walt's advice. I was going to be the ghost in the machine. I sat in the darkening office as the sun dipped below the industrial horizon, realizing that the woman I had shared a bed with for nearly 2 decades was a stranger who had been wearing my wife's face. I wasn't just protecting my money anymore. I was fighting for the right to exist as my own man. The sound of Diane's sedan pulling into the driveway was a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of the office. I sat frozen in the darkening room, the manila envelope of forged signatures tucked back into its hiding place, my pulse thrumming in my ears like a distant factory drum. I had exactly 90 seconds to transform from a man who had just unmasked a monster into the weary, unsuspecting husband she expected to see. I moved with a practiced, mechanical stillness, exiting the office and settling onto the living room sofa just as the front door creaked open. The house, which had felt like a crime scene only moments ago, was suddenly flooded with the freezing January air and the heavy, floral scent of Diane's perfume, a scent that now felt like a warning sign for a chemical spill. She entered the room with a calculated, theatrical exhaustion. Her shoulders were hunched, her eyes were artificially widened to appear rimmed with tears, and she moved with a slight stagger, as if the weight of Caleb's tragedy was physically crushing her. "Grant," she whispered, her voice cracking at just the right frequency to elicit pity. I didn't look up from the trade magazine I had grabbed at random. I forced my hands to stay steady, though they felt like they were made of vibrating wire. "In here," I said, keeping my tone flat, drained of the warmth that usually greeted her. She walked into the living room and stood over me, the cold from her coat radiating in the small space. She began a monologue that was as elaborate as it was hollow. A detailed account of the Barton Hospital ICU, the sound of the ventilators, and the cruel hospital administrator who had looked her in the eye and told her that Caleb would be moved to a state ward if the deposit wasn't paid. As she spoke, I did something I hadn't done in 17 years. I didn't listen to her words. I watched her mechanics. I saw the way her eyes darted to the side when she mentioned the $22,000, a classic tell of a liar under pressure. I noticed that her boots, despite her claim of walking through a Tahoe snowstorm to reach a pharmacy, were perfectly clean, save for the local road salt from our own driveway. She reached for my hand, her fingers cold and spindly, and I felt a jolt of pure, electric revulsion. This was the hand that had practiced my signature. This was the hand that had signed away my pension while I was sweating over a blast furnace. I let her hold my hand for exactly 3 seconds before I pulled it away to adjust my glasses. A small, silent rebellion that made her blink in confusion. "I called the insurance company, Diane," I said, my voice cutting through her frantic narrative like a chilling wind. The silence that followed was absolute. I could almost hear the gears in her head grinding as she tried to calculate how much. I knew they don't have a record of an out-of-state emergency claim for Caleb. I continued, finally looking her in the eye. The mask didn't slip immediately. It shattered and was replaced by a look of sharp, defensive indignation. She didn't offer an explanation. She launched an offensive. She accused me of being obsessed with money while her son's life was in the balance. She screamed that my mill worker cynicism was destroying our family. It was a masterful distraction, the shouting over the truth tactic that had kept me in line for a decade. But today, the noise didn't work. The more she yelled, the more I saw the desperation of a cornered animal. That night, we occupied the same house like two opposing armies in a stalemate. She retreated to the bedroom, claiming a migraine brought on by my cruelty, but I stayed. In the dark of the kitchen, watching the light from under the office door, I knew she was in there, checking the filing cabinet, perhaps wondering if the manila envelope had shifted an inch to the left. I sat with my own phone, my thumb scrolling through the photos of the forgeries I had taken earlier. I was no longer the safer name. I was the auditor. I spent the small hours of the morning logging into our joint bank accounts, watching the digital ledger in real time. I saw a pending transaction, a $4,000 transfer to an account under her maiden name. I didn't stop it, not yet. I watched it like a hawk, documenting the IP address and the timestamp. The betrayal wasn't just in the money, it was in the silence. I realized that every time I had shared a dream about our retirement, the cabin by the lake, the quiet mornings, she had been calculating how much that dream was worth in casino chips. I felt a hollow, aching grief for the man I used to be, the man who believed that love was a shield that protected you from the world. Now I knew that sometimes the shield is what they use to pin you down while they take everything else. As the sun began to peek over the industrial horizon, casting a cold, gray light over the kitchen tiles, I felt a grim sense of readiness. The silent counter-strike wasn't about a sudden explosion. It was about the slow, methodical removal of every support beam she relied on. I was going to let her believe she was still in control, right up until the moment the floor vanished beneath her feet. The following Tuesday broke over the Monongahela Valley with a harsh, blinding glare, the sun reflecting off the fresh snowfall like light off a polished blade. It was the kind of morning where the air is so cold it feels brittle, as if the whole world might shatter if you raised your voice. I dressed in my old work hoodie and heavy boots, the uniform of a man who had spent his life building things that were meant to last, and drove toward the city center. My destination was the Central Credit Union on Liberty Avenue, a squat building that smelled of stale coffee and industrial-grade carpet, a place where I had deposited every paycheck for 35 years. Walking through those glass doors, I felt like a man carrying a live wire. But the weight of the evidence in my pocket was the only thing keeping me upright. I asked for Linda, a woman with graying hair and a no-nonsense stare who had seen me through mortgages, car loans, and the small, hopeful savings account I'd started for a retirement that now felt like a cruel joke. When we sat in her wood-paneled office, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I told her I needed to ring-fence my pension and move every cent of my personal equity into an account that required a two-factor authorization she would personally oversee. Linda didn't ask for the gory details. She had worked in a mill town long enough to recognize the haunted look of a man being bled dry by his own kin. She slid a stack of forms across the desk, heavy, official paper that felt like armor. As I signed my name, the real Grant Miller's signature, I felt the first true breath of air in days. I was severing the tether. I was cutting the fuel lines to the fire Diane had been stoking while I was asleep. From the credit union, I drove 3 blocks down to a small, cramped law office tucked above a dry cleaner. The air there was thick with the scent of chemical steam and old dust. I wasn't there for a divorce, not yet. I was there for a legal separation, a surgical strike designed to bifurcate our liabilities before the casino's collection agents could sink their hooks into my marrow. My lawyer, a man who looked like he'd spent his career fighting for scrap in the ruins of the local industry, explained the strategy with cold, mechanical precision. By filing for separation now, I was creating a legal date of departure, Anything Diane or Caleb did from this moment forward, any marker they signed, any loan they forged would be theirs alone to carry. I felt a grim, hollow ache as I signed the petition. It was the death certificate of a 17-year promise, but I knew now that the promise had been a one-way street. I was protecting the safer name by removing it from the board entirely. Returning home that afternoon was like entering a theater mid-performance. The house was too warm, the air smelling of a pot roast Diane had started in a desperate attempt to reset the mood. To domestic bliss, she met me in the kitchen, her eyes searching mine with a terrifyingly sharp intensity. She had found out. The bank would have notified her of the account changes, and the shift in her energy was palpable. The sweetness was gone, replaced by a jagged, cornered animal desperation. She didn't scream. She hissed, her voice vibrating with a venom I hadn't known she possessed. She demanded to know why the cards were declined at the grocery store, why the joint savings looked like a ghost town, and why I was abandoning my family when they were at their lowest. I stood there, leaning against the counter I had installed, with my own hands, and looked at her and saw the stranger she had always been. I told her, my voice as steady as a heartbeat, that the accounts were frozen because my name was being used for things I hadn't authorized. I watched her face go through a frantic series of calculations, denial, rage, and finally, a calculated burst of tears. She fell into a kitchen chair, sobbing about Caleb's surgery and how the hospital was threatening to move him to a state facility if they didn't get the deposit. It was a beautiful performance, but I was an audience of one who had already read the script. I didn't reach for her. I didn't offer a tissue. I simply told her that I knew about the casino markers in Atlantic City, and I knew about the Manila envelope in the office. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that exists in the heart of a vacuum. Her tears stopped instantly, wiped away by a cold, hard mask of realization. The game of shadows was over, the lights were on, and the rot was visible for everyone to see. She didn't try to explain. She just stared at me with a hollow, dark intensity that made me realize the woman I loved had died a long time ago, if she ever existed at all. That night, I slept on the sofa with my phone in my hand, listening to the floorboards creak as she paced the house like a ghost, realizing that the man she thought she could manage had finally walked out of the cage. The federal building in downtown Pittsburgh was a monolith of gray stone and reinforced glass, a structure designed to drain the color out of anyone who walked through its heavy revolving doors. It was a place of cold marble and echoing hallways, where the air felt thin and tasted of floor wax and old, dusty law books. Justice, I realized as I adjusted the collar of my dress shirt, wasn't meant to be a comfort. It was meant to be a reckoning. I sat on the hard wooden bench in the back of courtroom 4B, my folder of evidence gripped in my lap so tightly my knuckles were the color of bone. This was the final shift, the one that would determine if I walked away a free man or a ghost of someone else's crimes. Diane arrived 10 minutes late, her heels clicking a sharp, frantic rhythm against the marble that sounded like a countdown. She was dressed in a navy suit she'd bought for a funeral 3 years ago, her hair pinned back with a severity that made her face look like a porcelain mask. She didn't look at me, not even a glance, but the tension radiating from her was a physical thing, a heat that seemed to warp the air around her. Caleb was led in through a side door by a bailiff. Seeing him in that light, away from the shadows of our house, was a shock. He looked smaller, his skin a sallow, sickly yellow under the fluorescent lights, his face puffy from the altercation that had started this whole collapse. He looked like a child wearing a man's problems, and for a split second, the old habit of pity stirred in my chest. I killed it before it could breathe. The judge, a man named Henderson who looked like he had been carved out of a block of Appalachian oak, took the bench, and the room fell into a heavy, expectant silence. The prosecutor opened the case with the clinical, unfeeling efficiency of a coroner. He spoke of systematic identity theft, wire fraud, and the calculated exploitation of a domestic partner's credit. As he spoke, he projected the images I had taken in the office onto a large screen: the practice signatures, the burner phone logs, the transfers to Diane's secret maiden name account. Seeing my own life laid out as a series of criminal exhibits was a strange kind of agony. It was the autopsy of my marriage, performed in public before a room full of strangers who would forget our names by dinner. When I was called to the stand, the walk felt like it took a mile. I took the oath, my voice steady and low, and I answered the questions with a flat, industrial honesty. I denied every authorization. I confirmed that the signatures on the $50,000 casino marker were not mine. I watched Diane's attorney whisper frantically in her ear, but she just stared at the floor, her hands twisting a damp tissue into a shredded white knot. But the true turning point, the moment the foundation finally crumbled, came when the prosecutor called their final witness, Rick Vance. The name hit the room like a physical blow. Diane's head snapped up, her mouth falling open in a silent, jagged O of pure terror. A man walked through the back doors broad-shouldered, wearing a clean but faded flannel shirt and work boots that had seen as many miles as mine. This was the deadbeat ghost Diane had spent 17 years telling me had abandoned them in the night. Rick took the stand, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the microphone. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a man who had been starved of the truth. Under questioning, Rick revealed the ultimate betrayal. He hadn't disappeared. He had been living 3 towns over, working a warehouse job and paying child support through a private legal arrangement Diane had insisted on to keep things simple. He had tried to see Caleb, tried to be a father, but Diane had told him that Caleb hated him, that Caleb considered me his only father, and that any contact would shatter the boy's mental health. Simultaneously, she had told me that Rick was a dangerous alcoholic who wanted nothing to do with them. She had built a wall of lies between 2 men, using me as the financial provider and Rick as the secret piggy bank, all while keeping the boy dependent on her so the money would never stop flowing. I only found out about Grant Miller when the casino tracked me down, Rick said, his voice breaking as he looked at Caleb, who was now sobbing into his hands. They thought I was the one who signed the papers. I didn't even know Grant existed. Until last month, I thought he was just a name Diane made up to keep me away. The courtroom went cold. The silence was so heavy it felt like it was pressing the air out of my lungs. The safer name wasn't just about my credit score. It was a character Diane had created to keep everyone in her life isolated and profitable. The judge leaned back, his eyes dark with a weary, profound disgust. He dismissed the claims against me on the spot, his gavel striking the wood with a sound like a gunshot. But for Diane and Caleb, the reckoning was just beginning. Conspiracy, identity theft, and fraud charges were read out in a drone that sounded like a funeral dirge. As the bailiffs moved in to lead Diane away, she finally looked at me, her face a map of ruin. "I did it for him, Grant," she whispered, her voice a ghost of the woman I thought I knew. "No," I said, my voice echoing in the hallowed quiet of the room. "You did it because it was easier than being honest. I'm done paying for your shortcuts." I turned and walked out, leaving the wreckage of 17 years behind me, finally understanding that the truth doesn't just set you free, it leaves you standing alone in the ruins, finally able to breathe the clean, cold air. The house in the suburbs didn't take long to sell in a market like Pittsburgh. There's always a young couple looking for a house with good bones, even if they have no idea about the ghosts that haunt the hallways. I watched them walk through the rooms during the final inspection, their eyes bright with the naive excitement of first-time ownership. They saw a well-maintained kitchen and a sturdy roof. They didn't see the office where a woman had practiced my signature like a high-stakes forgery. Nor did they see the bedroom where I had spent 17 years sleeping next to a stranger. I didn't tell them. I just handed over the heavy brass keys, took the check that represented the final liquidation of my married life, and drove away. I didn't look in the rearview mirror as I crossed the city limits. I had spent enough of my life looking backward, trying to figure out where the cracks had started. I moved 3 hours north, far enough to escape the valley's smog and the lingering whispers of the plant guys who still didn't know whether to pity me or blame me. I found a small, weathered cottage on the rugged, steel-gray edge of Lake Erie, just outside Sandusky. It was a simple, one-story structure with cedar siding that had been bleached silver by the salt and the wind. It had a porch that faced the east, so the morning sun hit my coffee mug before the rest of the world could start making demands. The first few weeks were an exercise in sensory deprivation. The silence was so absolute it felt heavy, a thick pressure against my eardrums that made my head ache. After nearly 2 decades of high-alert living, of waiting for the next 2 a.m. phone call, the next emergency, the next manufactured crisis, my nervous system didn't know how to exist in a state of peace. I found myself reaching for my phone. In the middle of the night, my thumb hovering over a screen that was now blessedly dark. I spent my days doing the kind of work that had a clear beginning and a solid, honest end. I repaired the porch railing that the winter storms had battered. I cleared the brush from the shoreline until the view of the lake was unobstructed and vast. I started volunteering at the local union hall 2 mornings a week, sitting at a folding table with men my age who were struggling to understand their retirement paperwork. I became an expert in the fine print. I showed them how to freeze their credit, how to set up two-factor authentication, and how to spot the soft pulls that meant someone was testing their fences. I was teaching them the lessons I had learned in the fire, ensuring that their names would never become safer names for anyone else's greed. I heard from Diane only once, about 6 months after the trial. It was a letter, handwritten on lined yellow paper that smelled of the harsh industrial detergent they used in the state correctional facility. There was no mention of Caleb's surgery or the deposits she used to beg for. Those lies had no currency where she was. She wrote about the fog she had lived in, claiming that her love for her son had mutated into something she didn't recognize. She said she was sorry, but as I sat on my porch and read the words, they felt like dry leaves, fragile, dead, and easily scattered by the lake wind. I didn't write back, not out of anger. Anger takes more energy than I was willing to spend, but out of a realization that forgiveness didn't require me to let her back into my life. I had spent 17 years being her shock absorber. I was done. Caleb was in a mandatory treatment program as part of his plea deal, according to Walt, who still called me every Sunday from Rudy's diner to give me the valley gossip. The boy was actually showing signs of progress for the first time in his life. Caleb was standing on his own defeat because there was no one left to catch him when he fell. It turns out that when you remove the safer name from the equation, people are forced to face their own reflection. I wished him well, and I meant it, but I did it from 3 hours away, across a boundary of cold, deep water. One evening, as the sun began to dip low over Lake Erie, turning the water into a sheet of hammered copper, I sat on my porch and realized that the safer name was finally my own again. Revenge hadn't come with a shouting match or a dramatic explosion. It had come with the quiet clicking of my own furnace and the realization that I didn't owe the world anything but my own survival. I had survived the slow poison of betrayal, and I had come out the other side with my dignity intact. I looked out at the horizon, where the lake met the sky in a seamless line of gray, and I felt a sense of release that was more powerful than any verdict. Love without limits isn't love, it's a liability. I had finally learned where my boundaries were, and I had built them out of the same steel I had spent my life forging. I finished my coffee, walked inside to a house that was entirely mine, and for the first time in 17 years, I slept all the way through to the morning. The first anniversary of my move to the lake arrived with a quiet, biting frost that crystallized the edges of the reeds along the shore. I stood on the porch, wrapped in a heavy wool coat that smelled of wood smoke and the sharp, clean air of the Great Lakes, watching the fog roll off the water like steam from a cooling ingot. It had taken a full year for the phantom echoes of my old life to finally stop ringing in my ears. For a long time, the silence of the cottage had felt like a trap, as if the absence of chaos was just a precursor to a bigger explosion. I had lived so long in a state of hypervigilance, monitoring Diane's moods, calculating the truth behind Caleb's latest disaster, and bracing for the financial impact of their next emergency, that I had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without a mission. But this morning, as I watched a lone hawk circle over the gray expanse of Lake Erie, I felt a deep, resonant stillness. The war was over, not because I had won, but because I had stopped participating. I spent the afternoon at the local library, a small brick building in Sandusky where the heaters hummed with a comforting, steady drone. I had become a regular there, not just for the books, but for the clarity. I sat at a corner table with a legal pad, the same kind I had used to document Diane's betrayals. But today I wasn't writing down dates of forgeries or amounts of stolen money. I was writing down a new set of rules for the safer name, I thought, about the men I had met at the Union Hall over the past year, men like me, who had worked 40 years in the heat and noise, only to find that the people they loved most viewed their retirement funds as an inheritance to be spent early. I realized that my story wasn't just about a bad marriage. It was about the dangerous invisibility of the provider. We are the safe ones, the ones who don't complain, the ones who fix the leaky faucets and pay the bills without asking for the receipt. And in that silence, we become the perfect targets. By late afternoon, I drove back to the cottage, stopping at a small roadside stand to buy a bag of apples and a jug of cider. The simplicity of the transaction, the exchange of honest cash for a tangible good, felt profoundly satisfying. I thought back to the trial, to the moment Rick Vance had taken the stand and dismantled 17 years of Diane's carefully constructed mythology. I wondered if she sat in her cell thinking about the fact that she could have had a real life if she hadn't been so obsessed with the shortcut. She had traded a husband who would have walked through fire for her for a series of casino markers and a set of forged signatures. It was a bad trade, the kind of move a desperate gambler makes when they've lost sight of the value of the chips. As night fell, I built a fire in the hearth, the dry apple wood popping and crackling as it caught. The light danced across the walls of the cottage, illuminating the few things I had chosen to keep: my grandfather's watch, my Union service pins, and a photo of the mill on the day I retired. I didn't have any photos of Diane or Caleb. I had burned them months ago in a small bonfire on the beach, watching the ink curl and blacken until their faces were nothing but ash. It wasn't an act of hate, it was an act of clearing the ledger. You can't build a new life on top of a crime scene. I sat in my chair, the heat of the fire soaking into my joints, and realized that the greatest victory wasn't the legal separation or the freezing of the accounts. It was the fact that I no longer felt the need to explain myself. I didn't need a judge to tell me I was a good man, and I didn't need a wife to validate my worth with a manufactured smile. I was Grant Miller, not a guarantor, not a safer name, and not a wallet. I was a man who had earned his peace, and for the first time in my life, that was enough. The lake wind picked up outside, whistling through the cedar siding, but I didn't check the locks, and I didn't check my phone. I just leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the silence carry me into a sleep that was deep, honest, and entirely my own. If you like history, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.